The wind howled through the trees surrounding the old farmhouse, rattling the windows like ghostly fingers tapping against the glass. The McAllister family, Ethan, his wife Claire, and their daughter Lily, had lived in the house for generations, nestled deep in the Arkansas countryside. Life was simple, quiet, and predictable. That was until the first knock came. It was a little past midnight when Ethan heard it. A soft, deliberate knock against the wooden door, too quiet to be the wind. He sat up in bed, listening. Claire stirred beside him, groggy from sleep. "Did you hear that?" she mumbled. Ethan nodded and slipped out from under the blankets, heart hammering as he crept to the front door. Peering through the peephole, he saw nothing but darkness. He hesitated before unlocking the door and opening it just a crack. A rush of cold air swept inside. Standing on the porch were two children, a boy and a girl, both dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Their heads were tilted downward, obscuring their faces. "Can we come in?" the boy asked, his voice strangely hollow. Ethan's gut twisted. Something about them felt wrong. He hesitated before shaking his head. "It's late. You should go home." Without a word, the children turned and stepped off the porch, disappearing into the darkness. As Ethan shut the door and locked it tight, an unease settled over him. Something told him this was only the beginning. The next morning, Ethan told Claire about the children. She frowned, setting down her coffee. "Maybe they were lost?" she suggested. "Kids around here don't usually wander at night." "I don't think they were lost," Ethan murmured. Something was off about them. Lily, their 10-year-old daughter, overheard and chimed in. "What kids?" Ethan hesitated. "Just some kids at the door last night. Nothing to worry about," but worry crept in regardless. Later that afternoon, thick fog rolled in, swallowing the fields in a dense gray mist. The animals were restless, their nervous whinnies and bleats filling the air. As Ethan worked in the barn, a sense of being watched prickled at his skin. Claire, inside, was washing dishes when a soft knock echoed through the house. She stiffened, turning toward the door. Peering through the window, she saw the same two children standing on the porch, their heads still bowed. A deep, instinctual fear gripped her. She backed away as the boy spoke again, his voice flat and emotionless. "Please, let us in." She turned and bolted, locking herself in the bedroom. Outside, the knocking continued, slow, rhythmic, insistent, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. That night, Claire lay awake in bed, listening for any signs of movement outside. The silence was deafening, pressing against her ears like a heavy weight. She turned to Ethan, who was also awake, staring at the ceiling. "We need to find out who they are," she whispered. "This isn't normal." Ethan sighed. "I'll ask around town tomorrow. Maybe someone knows about them." Morning arrived with a blood-red sunrise, casting eerie shadows through the mist still clinging to the land. Ethan drove into town, stopping by the local diner where the old-timers gathered for their morning coffee. He brought up the strange children, hoping someone had seen them before. The room fell silent. A few men exchanged uneasy glances before one of them, an elderly farmer named Hank, cleared his throat. "You best not be letting them in," he warned. "Ain't natural, them kids." "What do you mean?" Ethan pressed. Hank sipped his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. "They've been seen before. Always two of 'em. Always knocking. Folks say they ain't human. Just shadows wearing the faces of children." Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. He didn't believe in ghost stories, but something about Hank's voice made him wonder if he should. Back at home, Claire spent the morning keeping Lily occupied, unwilling to tell her about the children. But Lily had a way of sensing when something was wrong. "Mom, why don't you want me near the windows?" she asked as Claire pulled the curtains shut. "Just keeping the house cool," Claire lied, forcing a smile. "Go play in your room, sweetheart." Lily didn't look convinced but obeyed. Claire sat down, rubbing her temples, when she noticed the backyard, footprints in the damp earth, circling the house. Ethan returned home with a grim expression. "They aren't just kids," he said, voice low. "Hank and the others. They say they've been around for years. No one knows where they come from. And the people who let them in, they disappear. Claire swallowed hard. Then we don't open the door. No matter what. That night, as darkness swallowed the countryside, the knocking returned. And this time it was louder. The knocking continued for hours, slow and deliberate. Each knock sent a shiver down Claire's spine. Ethan gripped a shotgun, though he knew deep down it wouldn't help. Then, just before dawn, it stopped. Silence settled over the house. The sun rose hesitantly, casting a pale light over the land. Lily yawned, rubbing her eyes. "Mom? Dad?" She stepped into the hallway, confused by the tense atmosphere. "What's going on?" "Nothing, sweetheart," Claire whispered. "Go get dressed." Ethan went outside to check the porch. His stomach twisted at the sight of the wooden boards. Deep scratches marred the surface, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. "We need help," Claire murmured. "We need to leave." Ethan exhaled, gripping her hands. "We can't. Not yet. We need to understand what we're dealing with." That night, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, a whisper drifted through the air, carried on the wind. "Let us in." It was no longer just knocking. The children were speaking, and they sounded hungry. Ethan could no longer ignore the fear gnawing at his gut. The following morning, he made the drive back into town, determined to find answers. He stopped by the library, scouring old newspapers for any mention of strange children appearing in the area. The further back he went, the more unsettling the stories became. Reports of missing persons, eerie encounters, and farmhouses abandoned overnight filled the archives. Each story had a common thread: black-eyed children, always appearing at night, always asking to be let inside. One article, dating back to 1953, sent ice through his veins. A family, the Halstons, had lived not far from their own farm. The father, like Ethan, had refused to let the children in. Days later, his wife and daughter had vanished without a trace. The man was later found wandering the woods, muttering about how they had taken them into the dark. Ethan closed the newspaper, his hands trembling. He had to protect Claire and Lily no matter what. Back at the farmhouse, Claire noticed something new. Along the edges of their windows and doors, small symbols had been scratched into the wood, strange, looping marks she didn't recognize. Panic surged in her chest. "Ethan," she called as he returned home. "Come look at this." Ethan inspected the markings, his pulse pounding. "They're getting bolder," he murmured. "Whatever these symbols mean, they left them for a reason." That night, they stayed up with every light in the house burning. When the knocking resumed, Claire clutched Lily close, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. "Let us in," the children pleaded from the other side of the door. "We just want to come inside." But the McAllisters knew better. They weren't children, and they weren't leaving. The next day, Ethan drove back into town, determined to find someone who could help. He went to the only place he hadn't tried, the home of old Mrs. Abernathy, a reclusive woman rumored to know things others dared not speak about. She opened the door just enough to see him. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she rasped. "The black-eyed ones." Ethan's throat tightened. "You know about them?" "I know they ain't human. And I know they don't stop." He swallowed hard. "How do we make them leave?" She handed him a small leather pouch filled with a pungent mixture of dried herbs. "Salt and iron keep 'em at bay, but it won't last forever. You need to break the connection they have to your land. They're marked, and now so are you." Ethan took the pouch, dread settling in his gut. "How do I break the connection?" Mrs. Abernathy hesitated. "Find their origin. Destroy it. But be warned, it won't be easy." That evening, Ethan spread salt along every entrance of the farmhouse. He and Claire placed iron nails in every window frame, desperate for any protection. But something in Mrs. Abernathy's words haunted him. Find their origin. He remembered the old well at the back of the property, a relic from before his grandfather's time. No one had used it in decades. A deep sense of unease settled in his chest as he grabbed a shovel and made his way toward it. Digging near the well, he uncovered something horrifying. Small bones, buried deep beneath the earth. Tiny skulls, brittle with age, peered up at him, empty sockets staring. Claire gasped when she saw them. "Ethan, what did we just find?" Before he could answer, a cold wind swept through the farm, and the whispers returned. "You found us. Now let us in." Ethan's mind raced. The bones, they must have belonged to children. But who had buried them here? And why? Back inside, he scoured the family's old records, searching for any clue. An old ledger, tucked away in a dusty cabinet, revealed the dark truth. In the late 1800s, his great-great-grandfather, Silas McAllister, had taken in orphans. But the records abruptly stopped. No mention of where they had gone. "He did something to them," Claire whispered. "And now, they're here." The knocking started again, harder this time. The voices grew louder. "You must pay for his sins. Let us in." Ethan clenched his fists. "No." The front door shuddered as if something massive had slammed against it. The lights flickered. Then, a single whisper curled through the air. "Then we will take what we are owed." Claire grabbed Lily, holding her tight. The air grew colder. The black-eyed children would not stop. And now they were angry. The farmhouse groaned under the weight of an unseen force. Ethan gripped a shotgun, though he knew it would be useless against whatever lurked outside. Claire sat with Lily in the center of the living room, whispering prayers under her breath. Then, the whispers turned to laughter, childlike, taunting. Ethan peered through the peephole, his breath catching in his throat. The children stood motionless, their empty black eyes staring at the door. But this time they weren't alone. Shadows, twisting, writhing things moved behind them. They slithered through the night air, forming grotesque shapes that melted into the darkness. The door rattled. The windows creaked. A sickly, sweet voice whispered, "You cannot hide forever." Morning brought a false sense of safety, but Ethan knew nightfall would bring worse horrors. They had to act fast. He and Claire returned to the well, determined to dig further. Hours passed as they unearthed more remains. Then, a discovery that chilled them both. A rusted locket. Inside it, a photograph of a young girl. On the back, a single word was etched. Anna. Ethan took it to Mrs. Abernathy. When she saw the name, she paled. Anna was Silas McAllister's first ward, and his first victim. What happened to her? Ethan demanded. Mrs. Abernathy hesitated. He sacrificed them. He believed it would bring him power. Their spirits were bound to this land, and until their suffering is acknowledged, they will never rest. Ethan set his jaw. Then we free them. Following Mrs. Abernathy's instructions, Ethan and Claire built a circle of salt and ash around the well. They gathered the bones and placed them inside, lighting candles around them. Lily, sensing the weight of the moment, clutched Claire's hand. "Will this make them go away?" Ethan wished he could promise that. "I hope so, sweetheart." As night fell, the air grew thick with tension. The whispers returned, rising into an unearthly wail. The shadows moved faster, writhing at the edges of the candlelight. The black-eyed children stepped forward, their faces twisted with rage. "You cannot erase what was done." Ethan steeled himself. "I can try." Ethan lit a match and dropped it into the well. Flames erupted, burning unnaturally bright. The air trembled with screams, not of pain, but of release. The shadows recoiled, their forms twisting, dissolving into the fire's light. The black-eyed children let out a final, collective wail before their bodies flickered, fading into wisps of darkness. Then silence. The night was still. The oppressive presence was gone. Claire pulled Lily into her arms, tears slipping down her face. "Is it over?" Ethan stared into the smoldering well. "I think so." Days passed, and the farmhouse felt different, lighter almost. No knocking at night, no whispers on the wind. The land, once cursed, now seemed peaceful. Ethan visited Mrs. Abernathy one last time. "I think we did it." She studied him carefully. "Maybe. But spirits are tricky things, Ethan. If even one remains, the door stays open. Watch your little one." Her warning sent a shiver through him. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she smiled sleepily up at him. "Daddy, Anna says thank you." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What did you say?" Lily yawned, her tiny fingers brushing against the rusted locket she had found in the yard. "She's happy now, but she says some of them didn't leave." The farmhouse creaked, as if someone, still lingered in the shadows. Ethan barely slept that night. Every sound, every creak of the old farmhouse made his nerves jolt. He kept a close watch over Lily, who slept soundly, the locket clutched in her small hands. Claire stirred beside him. "You think it's really over?" she whispered. Ethan wasn't sure. "I don't know. But if some of them didn't leave, then we're not safe." The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees. And then, a faint knock. Not at the front door, but at Lily's window. Ethan rushed into Lily's room, his heart pounding. He threw open the curtains, shotgun in hand, but there was nothing outside. Just the empty night. Lily stirred. "Daddy," she murmured, rubbing her eyes. "Anna says not to be scared." Ethan crouched beside her. "Anna's still here?" Lily nodded sleepily. "She says some of them can't leave. They don't want to hurt us. But one of them does." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "Who?" Lily's expression darkened. "The one in the shadows." Morning brought no relief. Ethan and Claire moved cautiously through the house, watching every corner, listening for whispers. Claire hesitated near the basement door. "Ethan, when was the last time we checked down there?" He swallowed hard. "Not since this started." Slowly, he unlocked the door and flicked on the light. The bulb flickered, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. He stepped down, his breath shallow. First, everything seemed normal. Then he saw it. A handprint, smudged into the dirt floor. Small. Too small to be an adult's. And it was pitch black. Ethan rushed back upstairs, slamming the basement door shut. "We need to get out of here." Claire's eyes widened. "What did you see?" He hesitated, not wanting to scare her. "Just proof that something's still here." But before they could pack, Lily called out from the living room. "Mommy! Daddy! Look!" They ran to her side. The locket had opened on its own, revealing a second picture, one that hadn't been there before. It showed a man in old-fashioned clothes, his eyes as black as the children's. Lily pointed. "That's the bad one. He doesn't want to leave." The floorboards groaned beneath their feet. Mrs. Abernathy's face darkened when Ethan showed her the photograph. "Silas McAllister. Your ancestor. He's the one who started it all." Ethan felt sick. "I thought he was just a man." He was. But he bargained with something he shouldn't have. When the children died, he didn't just sacrifice them. He bound their souls to him. If he's still here, then the curse isn't broken. Claire clenched her fists. "Then we end it. For good this time." Mrs. Abernathy exhaled sharply. "To sever his hold, you need to destroy what ties him here. His remains." Ethan grimaced. "Where do we find them?" She hesitated. "That's the part you're not going to like." Ethan's stomach turned as she pointed toward his home. "He's buried beneath your house." Ethan and Claire returned to the farmhouse, their nerves frayed. Digging up a centuries-old grave beneath their home wasn't just unsettling. It felt like inviting disaster. But they had no choice. With crowbars and shovels, they pried up the wooden planks in the basement. The dirt beneath was packed tight, undisturbed for generations. As they dug, a foul stench rose from the earth. Then, the metal scrape of a shovel against something solid. Claire gasped. A skeletal hand, fingers curled tightly as if still grasping something, emerged from the soil. Ethan recoiled but kept digging. Soon, a decayed coffin came into view, its wood rotting, its occupant long since turned to dust. Inside the coffin, clutched in skeletal fingers, was a book. Bound in leather, its pages crackled as Ethan lifted it. The moment he touched it, the house groaned. The shadows along the walls began to move. Ethan flipped through the pages, his breath hitching at the symbols and incantations scrawled in blood-red ink. This was no ordinary book. It was a conduit, a link between Silas and the spirits he had enslaved. Claire clenched her fists. "We have to destroy it." But as Ethan prepared to throw the book into the fire, the basement door slammed shut. A gust of wind howled through the room, extinguishing the candles. The darkness swelled, thick and suffocating. A voice rasped from the void. "You will not take what is mine." The black-eyed children materialized around them, their faces blank, their presence suffocating. But something was different. Some of them looked afraid. Then, from the darkest corner of the basement, a figure stepped forward. Silas had returned. The air turned frigid. Silas loomed over them, his hollow eyes pits of endless darkness. He raised a skeletal hand, and Ethan felt an invisible force clamp around his throat, lifting him off the ground. "You dare disturb me?" Silas hissed, his voice layered with inhuman echoes. Claire screamed, lunging for Ethan, but an unseen force sent her crashing into the wall. The black-eyed children stood frozen, watching, their expressions unreadable. Lily's small voice cut through the chaos. "Anna, help us!" One of the children, the smallest one, stepped forward. Her features softened, and for a moment, her black eyes flickered with something else. Recognition. She turned to the others and whispered something Ethan couldn't hear. Then, the children moved as one, their ghostly hands reaching for Silas. Silas roared as the children surrounded him. Their hands pressed against his body, their whispering voices growing louder. He twisted, writhing, but they held fast. The book in Ethan's hand began to glow. A final spell, a way to end this. With shaking hands, Ethan read the incantation aloud. The basement trembled. Silas let out a blood-curdling shriek as the shadows peeled away from him, revealing the withered corpse beneath. The children tightened their grip, pulling him down into the very soil he had defiled centuries ago. The book erupted into flames in Ethan's hands. The moment it turned to ash, Silas let out one final scream, and then he was gone. The children faded, one by one, their black eyes turning human again before they disappeared completely. Only Anna remained. She smiled at Lily before whispering, "Thank you." Then she too was gone. The farmhouse felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from its foundations. Claire touched Ethan's face, worry still etched in her features. "Is it really over?" Ethan exhaled, his body trembling. "I think so." Lily looked out the window, staring into the night. "They're not here anymore," she said softly. "They're free." For the first time in weeks, the night was silent. No whispers, no knocking, just peace. As the first rays of dawn stretched across the horizon, Ethan took Claire's hand. "Let's go inside." And for the first time in a long time, they did not fear the darkness. The days after Silas' banishment were eerily quiet. The house, once filled with unexplainable noises, now felt almost too still. Ethan and Claire spent their time repairing the basement floor, sealing away the grave where Silas had been bound for centuries. Lily, however, was changed. She seemed older, as if she had grown beyond her years overnight. She no longer spoke of Anna, nor did she seem afraid of the dark. But there was something distant in her eyes. One night, Claire sat beside her. Are you okay, sweetheart? Lily nodded but hesitated. I think I can still hear them. Claire's breath hitched. The children? Lily looked out the window, staring at the woods. No, something else. Ethan and Claire wanted to believe it was over, but unease clung to them like a shadow. The farmhouse, despite its newfound peace, still held secrets. One afternoon, Ethan found Lily sitting in the attic, whispering to herself. He stepped closer. Who are you talking to, Lily? She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. I don't know his name, but he's lonely. Ethan's stomach twisted. Lily, there's no one here. Lily just smiled, her gaze drifting to the corner of the room. He says that's what you think. The next morning, Claire found a strange symbol etched into the wooden frame of Lily's bedroom door. It hadn't been there before. A crude carving of an eye staring back at them. Ethan ran his fingers over the groove, a cold shiver running down his spine. This wasn't here yesterday. Claire swallowed. What if Silas left something behind? What if we didn't stop all of it? Ethan felt a familiar dread settling over him. They had fought so hard to free their family from the curse, but something told him the battle wasn't over yet. That night, Ethan woke to the sound of shuffling feet. He sat up, his heart pounding, and listened. It was coming from the hallway. Slowly, he crept out of bed and peeked into Lily's room. She was sound asleep, but the rocking chair beside her bed moved gently, back and forth, as if someone had just left it. A whisper brushed against his ear. You forgot me. Ethan spun, but the room was empty. Ethan and Claire returned to Mrs. Abernathy, desperation clear in their voices. We did everything you said. Silas is gone, the children are free. Why is this still happening? Mrs. Abernathy pursed her lips. You broke the curse on the children. But what about the one who started it? Ethan's blood ran cold. Silas. She shook her head. No, the thing Silas made a deal with, the entity that granted him power. If it's still waiting, then it won't let go so easily. Claire clutched Ethan's arm. Then how do we stop it? Mrs. Abernathy sighed. You'll have to face it, in its true form. Ethan and Claire sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Abernathy's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Its true form? What does that even mean? Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. Mrs. Abernathy's expression was grim. Silas was just a puppet. The real entity still lingers, feeding off the fear and pain left behind. And now it's looking for a new vessel. Claire's grip on Ethan's hand tightened. Lily, Mrs. Abernathy nodded. You need to act fast. If it chooses her, there will be no saving her. That night, the air in the farmhouse grew suffocating, thick with an unseen presence. Lily's whispers grew louder in her sleep, her small body twisting as if something was speaking directly to her. Then, at precisely midnight, the house trembled. The windows rattled, and the basement door flew open with a deafening bang. A gust of icy wind howled through the halls. Claire grabbed Lily, holding her close. Ethan, do something. Ethan stood frozen as a shadow emerged from the basement, its form ever shifting, darker than the night itself. The whispering voices merged into one, deep and guttural. She is mine. Ethan's mind raced. They had broken one curse, but this wasn't something that could be buried in the ground. This entity was ancient, more powerful than Silas had ever been. Mrs. Abernathy said we had to face it, Ethan muttered. What if we force it into the light? What if we expose it? Claire looked at him in terror. And if it doesn't work? Ethan swallowed hard. Then we don't make it through the night. As the entity moved closer, Ethan grabbed the lantern from the fireplace, its flame flickering wildly. Lily, listen to me. Tell it it's not welcome here. Lily shivered but stood firm. Go away, she whispered. The entity roared. The walls shook violently as the darkness swirled around them. The entity lashed out, sending furniture flying, shattering glass. Lily screamed as the shadow coiled around her like a serpent. Ethan charged forward, holding the lantern high. "You have no power here anymore. The curse is broken." The shadow recoiled but did not vanish. Instead, it shrieked, its formless mass stretching toward the ceiling. The room plunged into complete darkness. Then whispers filled the air, not of the entity, but of the freed children. A soft voice echoed through the chaos. "Anna," Lily whispered. The specters of the children materialized, their small forms glowing in the gloom. They reached for the entity, their touch burning through its shape. The entity thrashed wildly as the spirits closed in. Their tiny hands clung to the darkness, pulling it apart, piece by piece. The house quaked as the thing screeched, a sound so inhuman it felt as though the walls themselves would collapse. Ethan pulled Lily close, shielding her as the light from the spirits grew brighter, consuming the entity. It let out one last, piercing shriek before it imploded into nothingness. Then silence. The air cleared, the oppressive darkness lifting. The children, their task complete, turned to Lily, their black eyes now soft and human. One by one, they smiled before fading away. The house was finally still. Sunlight streamed through the windows as Claire, Ethan, and Lily sat in stunned silence. The house, once a place of torment, now felt warm, alive. "Is it really gone?" Claire whispered. Ethan exhaled shakily. "I think so." Lily looked at the empty space where the entity had stood. "They helped us," she said softly. Claire kissed the top of her head. "Yes, sweetheart, they did." Days later, Ethan and Claire dug one final grave behind the farmhouse. In it, they placed the charred remnants of Silas' book and a lock of Lily's hair, an offering to sever any last lingering ties. Mrs. Abernathy oversaw the ritual, nodding in approval. "The land is free now. No more spirits. No more darkness." Ethan threw the last shovel of dirt over the grave and took Claire's hand. "It's finally over." For the first time in weeks, Lily slept through the night without nightmares. The house remained quiet, peaceful. The horrors that had plagued them seemed like a distant memory. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Claire looked out at the porch. "We should sell this place. Start fresh somewhere new." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it's time." Lily, however, hesitated. "But what if someone else finds it? What if it happens again?" Ethan knelt beside her. "We made sure it won't. And if anything ever happens, we'll be ready." Packing up the farmhouse felt surreal. Each box carried memories, both good and bad. They had survived something most wouldn't believe, but the scars remained. As Ethan loaded the last of their things into the truck, he glanced back at the house one final time. He half expected to see a shadow in the window, a whisper in the wind. But there was nothing. Only the house, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, standing silent. Years later, the farmhouse remained empty. No one dared buy it, though the rumors of hauntings faded with time. It became just another relic of the past, its secrets buried deep. Lily, now grown, often thought back to that house, the spirits, and the darkness they had faced. She never forgot Anna, nor the children who had helped them in their time of need. One evening, as she walked through town, she passed by a little girl playing with a locket, the same one she had once held. The girl looked up at her and smiled. Her eyes were black,